July 6, 1943, dawn over the Central Front, near the town of Orel. The horizon is painted red by burning wheat fields. Below the low clouds, a formation of 20 Soviet Il-2 Sturmoviks cuts through the morning haze like a slow-moving wall of steel. Their engines, Mikulan AM-38s, growl in unison, sending deep vibrations across the steppe. In the cockpit of Red 23, Senior Lieutenant Ivan Grigorievich Pavlov adjusts his oxygen mask, squinting at the black smoke rising in the distance. Beneath his feet, hundreds of German panzers crawl forward, Tigers, Panthers, and the workhorse Panzer IVs, forming the tip of Operation Citadel. The Luftwaffe had promised their commanders air superiority. But right now, there's only one sound that dominates the battlefield: the low, rumbling drone of the Il-2s. Pavlov's rear gunner, Sergeant Anatoly Kovalenko, taps his shoulder and shouts over the intercom. "Targets ahead, comrade." "Armored column, heading east." Pavlov pushes the throttle forward. "Understood. Let's give them a wake-up." The Il-2, nicknamed Ilyusha by its pilots, was no beauty. Its wide wings and boxy fuselage made it look awkward, almost primitive, so much so that captured German troops once mocked it as a Fliegender Sarg, a flying coffin. They joked it was too slow to dodge and too heavy to climb. But they hadn't faced it in full force yet. The squadron descends to 300 meters, low enough that tree branches blur past. The first German trucks appear, fuel carriers and half-tracks clustered along a dirt road. Pavlov steadies his aim. The 23mm via cannons bark, firing armor-piercing rounds that shred through the convoy. Then come the rockets, 6 RS-82s streaking from under the wings, detonating in brilliant bursts of orange. Down below, panic spreads. Tank crews scramble from their hatches. Columns scatter into the ditches. For the first time, the Wehrmacht's advance stalls under an aerial assault it cannot counter. A German corporal dives for cover as fragments of molten steel rain down. He looks up and mutters, "Verdammt, it's that Coffin again." But the Coffin isn't dying, it's killing. The Il-2's skin hides a secret the Germans hadn't expected. Beneath its clunky shape lies a shell of armor up to 12 millimeters thick, forged around the engine, cockpit, and fuel tanks. Bullets and shrapnel bounce off like pebbles on a tank hull. Even direct hits from light flak fail to bring it down. Pavlov's aircraft rocks violently as black smoke erupts from the tree line. German 20mm flak-Vierling batteries opening fire. The sky turns into a storm of tracers. Pavlov doesn't pull up. He presses on. The Il-2s were built for this, to fly straight through hell and deliver death at point-blank range. He dives again, levels out just 50 meters above the ground, and releases another salvo. The explosions ripple across the column. Fuel trucks ignite. Ammunition trucks burst into flame. The earth shakes. The German line bends, breaks, and burns. When the squadron finally banks away, the landscape below is unrecognizable, a patchwork of fire and smoke. Pavlov looks back through the canopy. Kovalenko lets out a breathless laugh. "Flying coffin," they said. By the summer of 1943, that mockery had turned into fear. The Il-2 story began not on the battlefield, but in a Moscow-designed bureau 4 years earlier. 1939, the eve of war. Inside the offices of OKB Ilyushin, chief designer Sergei Vladimirovich Ilyushin stood before a team of weary engineers surrounded by blueprints and cigarette smoke. He pointed to a sketch on the wall, a plane with thick armor, no gunner, and a single goal: to kill tanks. "The Germans will come with armor," he warned. "We must meet them with steel from the sky." The concept was revolutionary: an armored attack aircraft, protected by a literal shell of steel plating, with the pilot and vital components encased within it. The Soviets would later call it Bronavoy Sturmovik, the armored storm plane. When the prototype first flew in 1940, it impressed no one. It was heavy, sluggish, and dangerously underpowered. Test pilots joked that it climbed like a cow on ice. But Stalin saw something in it. He ordered it into mass production immediately, a decision that would change the fate of the Eastern Front. By the time Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, only a handful of Il-2s existed. Most were destroyed on the ground in the Luftwaffe's opening blitz. But those that survived earned instant respect. They attacked tank columns outside Minsk and Smolensk, strafing with 23 mm cannon fire and releasing tiny bomblets that shredded infantry and fuel trucks alike. Still, losses were horrific. The Il-2's biggest weakness wasn't its armor, it was its lack of a rear gunner. German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Fw-190s, tore them apart from behind. Soviet pilots begged for protection. One even wrote to Stalin directly, "Comrade Stalin, give us rear gunners, or the Il-2 will be no more." Amazingly, the dictator read it and acted. Production lines were retooled overnight. The two-seat version of the Il-2 rolled out in 1942, equipped with a UBT 12.7mm machine gun for defense. It was heavier and slower, but infinitely deadlier. When German soldiers next encountered the flying coffins, they noticed something new. The planes didn't break formation. They didn't scatter when fighters appeared. They kept coming, straight and low, returning fire from the rear canopy. And when they did hit one, it often didn't fall. Reports poured into Wehrmacht intelligence describing aircraft that absorbed dozens of hits and still limped home. One captured German officer later remarked, "We called them the Bettenflugzeug, the concrete planes. You could empty a magazine into one and it would keep flying." By late 1942, the Il-2 had become a symbol of Soviet resilience and vengeance. At Stalingrad, entire regiments of the Red Air Force flew Il-2s in formation so low that soldiers on the ground could see the pilots' faces. They strafed German trenches with cannons, dropped fragmentation bombs on tanks caught in the rubble, and turned the frozen Volga front into a death zone for mechanized units. When the encirclement of Paulus's Sixth Army began, the Il-2s acted like flying artillery, hammering retreat routes and supply drops. One German survivor described it simply, "When we heard that engine, that deep growl, we knew we were finished." The flying coffin had become a flying tank, and its legend was just beginning. July 12, 1943, the fields near Prokhorovka, south of Orel. The greatest tank battle in human history was underway. Over 6,000 tanks, 2 million men, and thousands of aircraft clashed in a maelstrom of steel and fire. For the Red Army, the Il-2 was no longer an experiment. It was the hammer of the battlefield. More than 1,000 Sturmoviks filled the skies during Operation Kutuzov, supporting the Soviet counteroffensive. Their mission was clear: smash the German panzers before they could break through the defensive belts around Kursk. Senior Lieutenant Pavlov's regiment, the 291st Shap, took off from a dusty forward strip just after dawn. The men had slept beside their aircraft, surrounded by crates of rockets and 23mm ammunition. Mechanics still in grease-stained overalls gave quick handshakes as engines roared to life. The air smelled of oil and sweat. "Form up tight," Pavlov's voice crackled over the radio. "We hit the Panthers first, the long-nosed ones. Don't waste your rockets on trucks." The Sturmoviks climbed slowly, the morning sun glinting off their dull green armor. Ahead lay a sea of black smoke, flickering muzzle flashes, and endless German armor pushing forward. Below, Panzer Grenadiers looked up in disbelief. "Achtung! Il-2!" someone screamed. Then came the howl. The Il-2s dove in waves, not elegant, not fast, but relentless. They came in low, almost grazing the treetops, releasing their payloads at 400 meters. Each aircraft carried a mix of RS-82 rockets, PTAB anti-tank bomblets, and cannon shells designed to punch through thin armor. A rocket struck a Panther in the rear deck. A burst of flame shot skyward as ammunition cooked off. Another Il-2 stitched a column of half-tracks with cannon fire, turning men and machines into debris. The Germans opened up with every gun they had. Flak-Vierling 20mm, 88mm, MG-42s mounted on trucks. But the armored beasts kept charging through the wall of fire. Inside Pavlov's cockpit, the world was shaking. He could feel the impact of flak bursts rattling his armored shell. The air outside shimmered with heat and shrapnel. "Left! Left!" Kovalenko shouted as tracer rounds zipped past the canopy. Pavlov banked hard, his right wing grazing the treeline, and unleashed another salvo. The German line began to crumble. Their tanks, once symbols of invincibility, burned in black columns of smoke. Infantrymen dove for trenches, abandoning wrecks that glowed white-hot from repeated hits. On the ground, Red Army tankers cheered. Soviet T-34s rolled forward, using the chaos created by the Sturmoviks to crush what remained of the German spearhead. That day, Soviet reports claimed over 270 armored vehicles destroyed by Il-2 strikes alone. While exaggerated by wartime standards, even German archives confirmed the devastating psychological effect. Pilots of the Luftwaffe's JG-51 later wrote, "We feared nothing more than the arrival of the Il-2s. They came like thunder and left only smoke." By the battle's end, the Il-2 had become an icon of Soviet victory, the roar that announced the turning tide of the Eastern Front. But for the men who flew it, glory came with a terrible price. Late July 1943, an airfield near Belgorod. The sun hangs low over a patchwork of craters and burnt-out trucks. Rows of Il-2s sit idle, their green paint scorched black from exhaust and gunfire. Ground crews patch holes with sheet metal, rivets glinting like scars. The smell of fuel and burnt oil fills the air. Senior Lieutenant Pavlov climbs down from his aircraft, his face gray with exhaustion. He has flown 6 sorties in 24 hours. His hands still tremble from the engine's vibration. As he removes his helmet, a medic approaches with a clipboard. "Where's Sergeant Kovalenko?" Pavlov looks back toward the wreckage beyond the field. One Il-2 lies upside down, its tail torn off by flak. Smoke curls upward into the evening sky. He doesn't answer. Of the 12 aircraft that left that morning, 7 returned. It is a good day by Eastern Front standards. The Sturmovik pilots lived on borrowed time. For every German tank destroyed, another Il-2 fell to ground fire or interception. Crews often joked grimly that their average lifespan was 1 week. The cockpit's armored tub saved many, but when it failed, there was no escape. The Il-2 had no self-sealing fuel tanks, and its heavy armor made bailing out nearly impossible. Still, the pilots kept flying. The Red Air Force's propaganda called them the avenging falcons of the motherland. To the men themselves, they were just workers, hammering at the front, 1 sortie at a time. In his tent, Pavlov writes a letter home to his wife, Anna. "We fly low, always low. I can see their faces when I fire. Sometimes I think they see mine too. The Germans call us the Black Death. Maybe they are right." He folds the letter and places it beside a photo of her holding their infant son. Outside, the airfield buzzes with activity. A new batch of Il-2s has arrived, fresh from the factories at Kybyshev, where thousands of women work around the clock riveting armor plates and painting red stars on the wings. Production has become a national obsession. Stalin himself declared, "The Il-2 is as necessary to the Red Army as bread and air." By 1944, Soviet industry was producing up to 1,200 Il-2s a month, more than any other combat aircraft in history. Each one was built to replace the fallen. On the German side, the fear only grew. Wehrmacht reports described the distinctive growl of the Il-2's engine as a sign to take cover. Even veterans of the Eastern Front admitted it chilled their blood. "It was a sound of doom," one panzer commander recalled. "You prayed it wasn't your turn." In response, the Luftwaffe devoted entire fighter groups to hunting Sturmoviks. Pilots learned to attack from below and behind, aiming for the unarmored tail or oil radiator. But by 1944, with Soviet fighters like the Yak-9 and La-5FN providing escort, even that became a deadly gamble. The tide of war had turned, and the Il-2 led the way, flying low over retreating German columns, cutting them to pieces. Each sortie brought Pavlov closer to survival, or to death. January 14, 1945, East Prussia. Snow drifts across the frozen plains as another Soviet offensive begins. The Il-2s rise in tight formation from a captured airstrip near Warsaw, their engines coughing clouds of white vapor into the morning sky. The mission orders are simple: destroy everything that moves west. Senior Lieutenant Pavlov, now a veteran with more than 200 sorties, grips the control stick of his battered Sturmovik. Its fuselage bears the scars of 2 winters, dozens of patched bullet holes, faded kill marks painted under the cockpit. His new gunner, Corporal Misha Rudin, is barely 20 years old. "Cold enough for you?" Pavlov shouts through the intercom. Rudin laughs nervously. as long as they're colder down there. The Il-2s break through the clouds, revealing a German convoy below, trucks, half-tracks, and horse-drawn wagons retreating toward Königsberg. Pavlov rolls his aircraft and dives. From above, the German soldiers scatter in panic. They've seen this too many times. The low, thundering wings, the flash of rockets, the streaks of cannon fire. To them, it's not a plane anymore. It's a force of nature. Pavlov lines up his sights. The twin 23mm cannons roar, stitching the road with fire. One truck erupts in flame. Another flips sideways, spilling men into the snow. Rudin swings the rear gun toward a burst of tracer fire and squeezes the trigger, cutting down a machine gun nest that dared to return fire. Minutes later, the column is nothing but wreckage. Pavlov's squadron climbs through the smoke and banks east, the landscape below a graveyard of burning steel. They've flown this pattern so many times it feels ritualistic. Find, strike, vanish. Yet every time, the destruction is new. And with every mission, the Red Army pushes closer to Berlin. By now, the Il-2's reputation has spread far beyond the Eastern Front. Even Allied intelligence in London and Washington speaks of it with awe, calling it the flying artillery that broke the Wehrmacht's back. German field manuals are updated to warn soldiers, disperse your vehicles, hide under trees. The Il-2 hunts in daylight, but nothing could hide forever. By spring, the Soviets field over 3,000 operational Il-2s. They darken the sky during the final assault on Germany, hammering bridges, rail yards, and retreating convoys. The once mocked flying Coffin now symbolizes the unstoppable might of Soviet industry, forged from blood, metal, and vengeance. April 25, 1945, on the road to Berlin. Pavlov's formation flies through gray smoke and shattered clouds. Below them, the city burns. Anti-aircraft tracers rise weakly but miss. The Red Banner Army is crossing the Oder. The end is near. Rudin calls out, "Enemy armor, southwest." Pavlov banks hard, diving toward the Reich's dying war machine. Rockets streak out. One hits a Tiger tank squarely on its turret, the explosion lighting up the horizon. For a moment, Pavlov can't hear anything, only the dull ringing in his ears. He levels out, breathing hard, staring at the flames below. He knows the war is ending. When they land hours later on a muddy airstrip outside Kustrin, ground crews rush to refuel the planes for another sortie. Pavlov shuts off his engine and sits in silence. Around him, dozens of Il-2s gleam in the fading light. Armored beasts that once were jokes, now the very symbol of vengeance. The Il-2 would go on to become the most produced combat aircraft in history, over 36,000 built by war's end. But for the men who flew them, it wasn't the numbers that mattered. It was the roar of the engine, the vibration through the armor, the feeling of turning humiliation into retribution. The same German soldiers who once laughed at the flying Coffin would later write of the terror it inspired. The unstoppable dives, the iron wings, the thunderous approach that meant only one thing: death was coming. And when the red flag finally rose over Berlin, somewhere in the distance, you could still hear it. That deep, unyielding growl of steel over snow.